If you're a Scandal fan, then you're familiar with Eli Pope and the horrible things he did on that show. What if I said South Africa had its very own Eli Pope during apartheid? This is the story of Eugene de Kock. Eugene Alexander de Kock was born on the 29th of January 1949 in a small town called Lourenço Marques. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, which we now know as Maputo, the capital city of Mozambique. But he grew up in Eastern Cape in South Africa. This area he grew up in had a mix of communities and different cultures, but Eugene grew up in a mostly white, Afrikaans speaking family that really stuck to their traditional conservative values during the tough times of apartheid in South Africa. His dad was a police officer who had a long run with the SAP, the South African Police, or now known as the South African Police Service, SAPS. He was pretty strict and disciplined, making sure that there was a sense of order and authority at home. His father's strong commitment to the apartheid regime and its security forces really shaped how Eugene saw his role in society. It gave him a strong sense of nationalism and a feeling that he really had to protect the interests of the white minority rule, like no matter what. Growing up like this meant Eugene was raised to believe that the world was pretty much set up to serve the needs of white men, which it still is, I think. I don't. He went to boarding schools, which was pretty common for white South African boys back then, especially for those whose families had connections to the military and the police. During his schooling years, he was part of a generation of Afrikaner kids getting ready for the military service. They were taught that they were the first line of defense against what they saw as a communist threat from anti-apartheid groups like the African National Congress, also known as the ANC. Can I admit that at my big age, I do not know what communism means? Don't judge me. Don't judge me. This created a lot of suspicion and hostility towards black South Africans, making Eugene more likely to turn to extreme violence to protect the government and its interests. With his dad's career in law enforcement and the militarized environment he grew up in, Eugene de Kock decided to follow in his father's footsteps and join the South African Police, SAP. He thought this path would let him uphold the values he had learned as a kid and serve the regime he had been taught to support. In the early days of his policing career, de Kock mostly handled traditional law enforcement tasks, but he quickly made the jump to the security branch, which was a specialized unit focused on counter-insurgency and political repression. This shift was a big deal to him as he became heavily involved in actions against those who opposed the apartheid government. His main job in the security branch was to find and neutralize threats to the apartheid government, mainly coming from anti-apartheid activists and various insurgent groups. As part of his training, Eugene learned important skills like surveillance, intelligence gathering, interrogation techniques, and how to use violence to shut down protests. He got really good at working behind the scenes, where state violence often went unnoticed and unpunished by the public. The vibe at the security branch was all about getting away with things, and officers were often encouraged to do whatever it took to keep control and maintain the regime's authority. This culture of impunity was everywhere and influenced a lot of the decisions made by the people at the branch. During these early years in the SAP, he was not just exposed to, but also actively took part in the kind of brutality that would later define his leadership of Vlakplaas, a unit infamous for its violent tactics. He was given the job of interrogating and torturing political prisoners, a role he started under the close watch of senior officers who had years of experience ahead of him. This early exposure to state-sanctioned violence really desensitized him to the moral implications of his actions, allowing him to carry out orders with little thought for the ethical consequences. De Kock picked up the infamous nickname Prime Evil. Imagine being nicknamed Prime Evil, because of how brutally violent his actions were and the ruthless reputation he built over time. He really made a name for himself when he became commander of Vlakplaas, a farm near Pretoria that turned into a secret base for a covert counter-insurgency team within the SAP security branch. Originally, this unit was set up to recruit and manage black operatives who would sneak into anti-apartheid movements, gathering intel and messing with their plans, which was crazy, like, to think about, because it reminded me of how, like, recently I just learned that, well, I'm not sure if this is factual or not, but you know how slaves were taken off the coasts of West Africa, like, let me just tell you what I heard this person say in this video. So, right, these white people come on boats, right? They dock their boats on the coast and they're given weapons, guns, and say, don't cause too much commotion and do not use violence, but gather those people. We're gonna go sell them, as quietly and as peacefully as possible. Do you think black people were dumb enough? Because I mean, we're not dumb. Do you think black people were dumb enough, like, to just leave with these strange men, strange, pale-looking men, to go anywhere? No. You know what I learned? That the people leading them to these boats were other black people. Dun, dun, dun. Sellouts. So they were working with the white people. And the other day I came to the conclusion that black people really don't want to, like, freedom or equality with white people, or to be on the same playing field. They just want to be white. I'm not going to explain that further. Do what you will with that. Vlakplaas was heavily focused on the African National Congress, the ANC, which was viewed as a major threat to the apartheid government. But under his tough leadership, the unit shifted gears and transformed into a ruthless death squad, taking out anyone they saw as a threat to the apartheid regime. Vlakplaas mainly operated as a secret death squad, going after political activists and other operatives involved in the anti-apartheid fight, not just in South Africa, but also in neighboring countries. He was in charge of operations where targets were kidnapped, tortured, and eventually killed. Many of these victims disappeared, with their bodies often never being found, which meant there was hardly any chance for justice or accountability. Vlakplaas carried out a lot of summary executions of anti-apartheid activists, including some big names from the ANC and other liberation movements. These killings often happened without any trial or due process, and the bodies were usually disposed of in ways that made it hard to identify them, effectively erasing any trace of their existence. This unit also pulled off several high-profile bombings and assassinations that went beyond South Africa's borders. He planned attacks on ANC members who were in exile in places like Mozambique and Botswana. They used car bombs, ambushes, and direct raids, all aimed at taking down the anti-apartheid leadership and spreading fear among those communities. Political prisoners and insurgents held at Vlakplaas faced some brutal torture, with De Kock getting personally involved or overseeing the interrogations. The goal of the torture was to squeeze out valuable information about anti-apartheid activities, trying to weaken the resistant movements that were a threat to the apartheid system. De Kock didn't just stick to operations in South Africa, he also ran missions in nearby countries where various anti-apartheid groups had their bases. These missions included targeted killings and bombings aimed at destabilizing and taking out the leadership of groups like the ANC and the Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO, showing just how far his unit would go with their violent tactics. Plus, his unit often teamed up with other agencies that were enforcing apartheid, like the military intelligence and special forces. These collaborations allowed them to share intelligence and resources, which really boosted the effectiveness and reach of his death squads, making their violent actions against those opposing the regime even more impactful. This man was relentless. Oh, he was relentless. This is a somewhat accurate timeline of his crimes and operations after he became commander. In 1983, de Kock was involved in the bombing of the Kosatu House in Johannesburg. This was actually before he was promoted to Commander of Vlakplaas in 1985. From 85 to 89, he oversaw numerous assassinations, including the killing of anti-apartheid lawyer Griffiths Mxenge. Mxenge's murder was particularly brutal because he was stabbed to death by a group of Vlakplaas operatives acting under de Kock's command. In 1986, he was involved in planning and executing cross-border raids into neighboring countries such as Mozambique and Swaziland. These operations targeted ANC members who were operating from exile. In one raid, six ANC members were killed in Swaziland. In 88, Vlakplaas operatives assassinated Dulcie September, the ANC chief representative in France. De Kock was believed to have been involved in planning or sanctioning the operation. As apartheid began to crumble in the late 80s and the early 90s, his actions became even more brutal. He orchestrated the bombing of Kotze House, the headquarters of the South African Council of Churches. This attack was intended to punish the council for its outspoken opposition to apartheid. Also in 89, de Kock and his unit were involved in the assassination of anti-apartheid activist David Webster. David was shot outside his home in Johannesburg, a killing that was later directly linked to Vlakplaas operatives under de Kock's command. In 89, another major killing was the PEPCO 3, which we'll get into later. Despite the ongoing negotiations to dismantle apartheid, Eugene and his unit continued the violent suppression of anti-apartheid activities. In 1990, he was implicated in the Craddock 4 murders, which we'll also get into later. Also in 1990, the Motherwell bombing happened. Vlakplaas operatives carried out an attack that killed 4 people, including 3 police officers who had become state witnesses against Eugene's operations. The bombing was meant to eliminate potential threats to the apartheid security apparatus. In 1991, de Kock was involved in the murder of Thami Zulu, an ANC commander who was poisoned by apartheid security forces. In 1992, as apartheid neared its formal end, he was involved in several last-ditch efforts to destabilize the transition. He orchestrated attacks to create chaos. This was because, like all white men, he realized that his power was running out. De Kock's Vlakplaas unit was finally shut down in 1992 as part of the broader demilitarization of the police force during negotiations between the apartheid government and anti-apartheid forces. However, he was like, fuck that, and continued to participate in covert operations aimed at destabilizing the political transition. Also in 1992, he was involved in a series of cross-border attacks in Lesotho, where multiple ANC members were assassinated. In 1993, finally, he was arrested for his involvement in illegal smuggling of weapons and other activities related to his operations. His trial began in 1994 and concluded in 1996. It was held at the Pretoria Supreme Court and lasted almost 2 years. De Kock faced a total of 121 charges, which included 6 counts of murder, kidnapping, torture, fraud and theft, conspiracy to murder, and illegal arms dealing. During this trial, there was three key testimonies and evidence. The first one being the testimonies of former Vlakplaas operatives like Dirk Coetzee, who was a former Vlakplaas commander. He provided a crucial testimony against de Kock. Secondly, there was evidence of state sanctioning, which the defense argued that de Kock was acting on behalf of the state and was following orders from senior officials in the apartheid government. They tried to frame him as a soldier who believed he was fighting a legitimate war against terrorists. The court was presented with documents and internal SAP communications that showed how de Kock and his unit were authorized to carry out covert operations, including the assassination of key anti-apartheid figures. Thirdly was de Kock's own testimony. Eugene testified in his own defense. In his testimony, he admitted to many of the crimes he was accused of, but maintained that he was following orders of his superiors. He implicated senior apartheid officials, including Adriaan Vlok, the former Minister of Law and Order, and General Johan van der Merwe, the senior police officer. Also during the trial, there were two significant incidents that occurred. First was the Pepco 3 murders, which included Sipho Hashe, Champion Kalela, I don't know if I'm saying that right, and Kakawuli Kotolozi, members of the Port Elizabeth Black Civic Organization, PEPCO. De Kock described how the men were abducted by Vlakplaas operatives, tortured for information, and then killed. Their bodies were burned to destroy evidence. Second was the Kosatu and Kotso house bombings. Both bombings were intended to intimidate organizations that were vocal critics of apartheid. De Kock's role in these bombings demonstrated the extent to which state-sanctioned violence targeted not just political activists but also civil society organizations. On the 30th of October 1996, he was finally convicted on 89 charges. He was sentenced to a total of 212 years plus 2 life sentences. De Kock was also convicted of using state resources to enrich other members of Vlakplaas, including arms smuggling and other illegal sales of weapons. In his sentencing, the judge called him a cold and calculating man who had caused untold misery to the families of his victims. Real. The judge noted that while he claimed to have been following orders, he had also acted with personal cruelty and a lack of remorse for the lives he had taken. The TRC was a waste of time, in my opinion. The TRC was established in 1995 as part of South Africa's post-apartheid reconciliation process, offering amnesty in exchange for full disclosure of politically motivated crimes. De Kock applied for amnesty, hoping to avoid additional jail time for his involvement in human rights violations. His testimony took place between 1996 and 1999. By the time of his testimony, de Kock had already been sentenced to prison. His testimony stood out because of his blunt and honest approach. Unlike a lot of others, he didn't try to downplay or deny what he did regarding the killings, assassinations, and tortures carried out by Vlakplaas. His demeanor was often described as cold and calculated. He spoke with little visible emotion, describing the gruesome details of operations with a soldier's detachment. However, de Kock also displayed moments of remorse, particularly when discussing the families of his victims. At times, he offered to assist in locating the remains of missing individuals. De Kock confessed to the murders of numerous anti-apartheid activists, including the Cradock four anti-apartheid activists whose bodies were burned and left by the roadside. Despite his cooperation with the TRC, he was not granted full amnesty. He had only served 20 years of his sentence before eventually being granted parole in January of 2015. His release sparked an outrage among many anti-apartheid activists. and families of victims who felt it undermined the fight for justice and accountability. After his release, he largely stayed out of the public eye, though some reports indicated he was cooperating with the government to find the bodies of the victims who disappeared during apartheid years. In my opinion, he didn't suffer enough. He should have suffered. Mind you, he was released in 2015. Was it January? Yeah, January of 2015. And his sibling, I don't know if it was his brother. I think it's his brother. It's a man's name. His sibling died in 2016. So he was released just in time for his brother's death. He could attend the funeral and everything. I don't like that. I don't like that at all. I don't like that at all. He was supposed to suffer. He was supposed to get the news of his brother dying while he was in prison, getting trapped by other black people who were in there. Does that make me a bad person? Actually, I don't care. But that concludes the story of Eugene de Kock. He was a terrible man, and he's still alive. He's 75. Why is this man still alive? Kill him. We need the death penalty in this country. I'm kidding. Anyway, see you guys next week on the next episode. Hope you really enjoyed this one. You guys aren't watching the previous episode on YouTube, so I'm gonna stop uploading on YouTube completely at some point. Yeah, see you next week.